Okay, I can't see the numbers, but I'm guessing that most people who are coming into the Zoom room are in the Zoom room, so I'm going to get started. First of all, just hello everyone. I hope everyone's doing well out there today, and a major thank you for taking what is, I know, really valuable time to spend that time with us here today. And in exchange for that valuable time, myself and my co-panelists, are going to try to deliver something that's interesting and of value to your work. So again, really appreciate everybody taking the time to log on and spend your time with us here today. My name is Nat Kendall-Taylor. I lead an organization called the Frameworks Institute. Spent the last 25 years of my career, studying the way that people think about complex social issues and how the way that we communicate about those issues influences, shifts, and shapes those understandings. I've worked in my time at Frameworks and my non-Frameworks time. I've worked on over 40 different social issues during that time. But one kind of common thread throughout all of that work is that I've always had work that's focused on early childhood. And I can say that early childhood is my favorite issue to work on. And apologies if there are other partners on the call who don't work on early childhood. I love your issues too, I promise. But I really am looking forward to presenting this work because it kind of is a new dimension, a new facet of the work that we have done on early childhood. So just a few housekeeping items before we get into the content and the discussion. We will not be doing a live Q&A today, and that's largely because there are almost 2,000 people who registered for this webinar. Instead, we're going to take some pre-submitted questions that a number of people were very kind and gracious to enter into the registration. So thank you everybody who did that. Don't worry, my panelists will just do the easy ones. I've pre-selected only the softball easy questions. Also, if I could just encourage folks who are on to stay all the way to the end, and that's for two reasons. One, it's going to be awesome. Like, you don't want to miss a second of this. And two, I've got a quick survey at the end that I'll put up a QR code for, and just ask that you fill out the survey, which really helps us get better at doing these webinars and assuring that they are kind of most helpful, most responsive to the issues and questions that you all have. We are also recording this session. The recording has already started, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording probably early next week to everybody who has registered. So you can expect to receive an email with a link to the recording in your inbox next week. So with that, I'm going to introduce my three panelists here. So I'm joined by, I think I can see you all on the screen, I think. I can see Lindsey. I'm joined by Lindsey Burghardt, who's the Chief Science Officer at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child and a longtime colleague and partner. It's really good to see you, and thanks for joining today, Lindsey. Also, Jacqueline Russell, who's President and CEO of a wonderful organization called Grown Up Navajo, Jacqueline's been great to get to know you throughout this project, and really looking forward to hearing kind of comments, reactions, and commentary in this hour together. And then Margot Brown, who's Senior Vice President of Justice and Equity at the Environmental Defense Fund. And I think Margot has some really unique and incredibly valuable perspectives as someone who works on environmental justice to bring into this conversation. It's a really great group. The plan is that largely I'm going to set the table and then get out of the way so that these three brilliant people can cook. And my 14-year-old told me that cooking is like really good, Dad. So that's what that means, just for people who don't have 14-year-olds. The plan is I'm going to present a little bit of the content from the project. I'll try to get this done in 15 to 20 minutes. And then I will kind of turn things over to the panel, ask some questions that we've prepared in advance. And then we'll go through some of the questions that you all, as participants, have, like I said, really generously pre-submitted. That's what we're going to do. Hopefully that works for everybody, because I can't see you, and we're going to roll here. So my job at the beginning is just to introduce the two concepts that we'll be talking about here today. And the first one is the concept of framing, something that I imagine most people who are on the webinar have heard about, have seen, defined in different ways. For the next 54 minutes, when we talk about framing, what we're going to be talking about is the choices that we make and how we present information and ideas. And those can be kind of fairly obvious choices, things like the values that we use. Do we talk about collective prosperity, the metaphors that we choose and use? Do we talk about brain and biological development, or do we talk about building brain architecture? But importantly, also about the kind of smaller and seemingly insignificant choices that we make all the time. The pronouns that we use when we talked about groups of people, do we talk about they, them, those people over there, or we and our? And something as small and seemingly insignificant as the verbs that we choose, whether we choose verbs that extend agency and power to groups of people, or ones that kind of rob or block that agency and power from groups of people. So the framing is all those choices, big and small, and how they affect three things that I know the panelists care a lot about in their work and what they're going to be talking a lot about. But I imagine that like 99% of the folks on the call also care about, which is how people think about our issues, how people understand the ideas that we're trying to communicate. Importantly, how people feel emotionally, how, whether and how people emotionally engage and lean in to what we're saying and where we're trying to take people. And then what people do, the actions, decisions, behaviors that result from people hearing the things that we have to say. And so the takeaway from framing is that what we know is important. So I've got three really great panelists who are deep content experts on the area that they work on. And I would never stand or sit in front of those panelists and say that what they know about early childhood and climate change doesn't matter. But my position here is to argue that there's something else that really matters as well, which is all the choices that we make in how we say what we have to say. And the idea of framing is that those choices are not just kind of pretty prose that we use to surround our otherwise brilliant ideas, but really are the difference between whether those ideas kind of cut through and have the effect that we want them to have, or whether they get swallowed up, rejected, and lead to some kind of backfire effects where people end up with the exact opposite ideas of what we're trying to communicate. Okay, so now that that's the first concept, framing, now that everybody is like all in on framing, I can see Lindsey. Lindsey is amped to hear more about framing. I want to unpack the second concept by telling you about this deceptively simple orange arrow that you see in the middle of the screen, which is one of the ways that these choices and how we say what we have to say affects how people think, how people feel, and how people act, is through a concept called cultural mindsets. And so there's four characteristics of cultural mindsets that are really key for our conversation here today, for us being able to realize the strategic value of cultural mindsets. And they are, first of all, that these are implicit patterns of reasoning, ways of thinking, assumptions that people have and use all the time without knowing that they're using them, right? So they're below the level of conscious thought. Two is that these mindsets, as you'll see in a second, powerfully shape how we see the world, how we see issues, particularly how we see groups of people, and how we consider and support solutions. Three, we all, on every given issue at all times, have multiple mindsets that we can use to think. Some of those mindsets are productive in relation to our goals, right? They open up thinking, they allow people to see the value and importance of solutions in new ways. And other mindsets do the opposite, right? They're unproductive. They close down thinking. They lead people to reject our ideas. They lock up or lock down support for new solutions and ways of thinking about addressing issues. And last but not least, the link between these two concepts is that the choices that we make and how we say what we have to say, how we frame our issues, determines at any given time which of these mindsets is foregrounded, where it plays this outsized role in shaping how we think and feel and act, and which of these mindsets are pushed to the cognitive background, where they play less of a role in shaping our thinking, feeling, and acting. And I want to make this a little bit more real for folks on the call right now. I'm going to show you a quick video. This is from work that we do in the UK on childhood obesity. So you're going to see an on-the-street interview. You'll hear the guy's accent and know that this was not an interview that was conducted in the United States. And what you'll see is a quick before and after. So the gentleman is asked a question about childhood obesity. He's then presented with a frame, with a way of thinking about the issue, and then he's asked the same question. So I want you to be on the lookout for the way that the before is different than the after. And I want to say just at the beginning that I've cherry picked this example such that that comparison, the difference between the before and the after, is fairly front and center and easy to spot. So here we go. Lindsey, I can see you. Just give me a thumbs up when this is playing to make so that I know that it's actually playing.
Immediately, I'm thinking that maybe the parents are coping with their children in maybe the wrong way. They're feeding them too much, giving them food to keep them immediately happy.
What would you say needs to happen for child obesity to go down?
Well, as I said, it's eating less and moving more, really. It just comes down to the things, the producers of food. If they're making stuff that's going to make us unhealthy, that needs to be addressed. To how the food is marketed, how aggressive that is, and how much it's particularly aimed at kids.
Okay, so I feel like it's a little facetious to say, did you notice the difference between the before and the after? So I imagine most people did. So what I'm using to show is the fact, first of all, that this gentleman in Brixton, in the southern borough of Lambeth in London, has multiple mindsets that he can use to think about this issue. So health individualism is where he starts, but what surrounds us, shapes us, is where he gets. And the thing that happens between those two expressions of mindsets, which lead to very different ways of thinking and talking and feeling about this issue, is the invitation to think about a metaphor, to think about the importance, the role of the food environment in how kids grow up and develop and have food choices that are accessible. So a good example, hopefully, that brings together framing, right? The way that we communicate activates certain mindsets, but also the importance of mindsets in shaping how people reason and make sense of social issues. Okay, so that's the boring background. Congratulations, you've all made it through. Everything else is life-changing at this point. It's going to be awesome. So we're going to shift now from framing of mindsets to the particular research that we've done with partners at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child and Sea Change, also at Harvard University, to kind of figure out how people think about the connections, or how people don't think about the connections, between the issue of early childhood and the issue of climate change. So the degree to which people are attuned to the way that climate change is affecting processes of brain and biological development. And the main finding, which is probably not hugely surprising to most people who are on the call, is that people don't. Right? People on their own do not make immediate default connections between early childhood development and climate change, and are largely, even when pressed to think about those connections, unaware of the ways that climate change is affecting development. So in our research, we found quotes like this, which were very kind of characteristic and representative of the way that people think about these issues and the way that they largely don't connect them, even when asked explicitly to make these connections. So this interview participant from research in August 2024 says, I feel like there should be, he's talking about the connections between early childhood and development, but I just don't know if I've ever thought about the correlation, because climate change as a whole, I mean, I always kind of like it was the responsibility of adults and all of that. I'm pretty sure that it does impact early childhood development, but it's not something that really ever crossed my mind. So this is really characteristic of the key finding. And then as another part of this project, we examined news media coverage of issues, and this kind of lack of connection between the issues in the way that people think starts to make sense. We start to see a reason why there's this lack of an inherent connection, lack of the ability kind of having kind of mindsets that allow people to see how early childhood is affected by climate. And that's what you see on the graph right now. So the orange line that you see kind of skittering across the screen is from a representative sample of news articles over the course of a year's sample, 2023 to 2024. And the orange line is all the stories that mention climate change. Now, the blue line, which is kind of hard to see because it's so close to the horizontal axis, is the number of those stories that also mention children. So climate change stories that also mention children. And then the line that's nearly invisible is a gray line, which is the number of those stories about climate change that mention children as well as health or development. So you can see that there's a large number of articles about climate. A very, very small percentage of them are about kids, or have to do with kids, and an even smaller percentage of that kind of connect the conversation to development and health. And so here's another view of this that really kind of puts that in stark relief. This is the number of articles during this time. You can see over 5 million that are about climate. Only just over 4% mention children, and only 1%, just less than 2%, kind of make the full connection between children and health and development. So this is like when we did this analysis, pretty seems like a pretty imposing challenge for those people who are working at the intersection of these issues that people do not connect these issues, that this is not a connection you can assume that people are making. At the same time, you see what I did there. The challenge is also the opportunity, which is when we see these kind of issues that are unmodeled, that are unconnected in terms of their importance and how they work, it's also an opportunity. It means that we don't have to we don't have to navigate pre-existing understandings, but instead can use our focus in terms of building those understandings, being really careful of how we're framing, how we're positioning our issues, such that we can kind of craft and make these connections between these concepts and encourage the kind of thinking about solutions and consideration of the well-being of kids and families as people are thinking about climate change. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time walking you through kind of three insights that really help us think about how to make and shape that connection. Given that it's a connection that doesn't exist, framing is really important and consequential in terms of how we help, how we encourage, how we give people practice in thinking about the ways that these two issues are connected. So first of all, we found, and again, we're really kind of pushing people to think about the way that climate change may or may not be connected to early childhood. We found largely that thinking exists as a set of two binaries. So people in the conversation of climate change either think children are incredibly vulnerable, or they think of children as incredibly resilient. And as my panelists will discuss, the truth or the fact or the science or the experience and the practice exists where most good ideas exist, which is in between those two binaries. So really, kind of what part of what we need to do is be really clear about the way that early experiences kind of affect development and kind of push people past this thinking that it's either totally vulnerable or totally resilient. Another binary that we saw is that people either think about the right here, right now, immediate health, physical well-being impacts of adverse weather events, or they think about effects as being kind of very, very, very far down the line, decades from now. And as we know, as panelists will discuss, climate change is affecting early childhood development and children and families right here, right now, and through the process of development is having these down the line cascading effects on a number of areas of learning, of well-being, of health. And so our recommendations here are really to try to introduce some of that nuance in terms of the way that we're talking. So to be really clear about the way that early experiences related to climate change are matter, but that there is plasticity, as Lindsey will surely talk about, in the systems that are developing to respond beyond the immediate exposure. To really explain, so a lot of the strategy that you're going to see come out of this work is one that shifts from a strategy of declaring effects to a strategy that explains effects. So explaining how climate change affects development is absolutely important. That's kind of the foundational strategy that this research suggests. And then to practice what we call now and later framing. So to highlight the present, the right here, right now impacts of climate change, but also by implicating the process of development, be really clear about the medium and long-term effects and impacts of these experiences. So the second finding, and I guess this is not terribly surprising given that these two issues are not super connected, is that structural inequalities or differential experiences are really not on the radar. And the importance of putting them there in our communications. So people assume that climate change kind of affects everyone equally. People say things like climate change does not discriminate. And then when people do kind of are pushed and do think about inequities, they tend to focus on class and not race. So they reason that poverty, not systemic racism, is really the determinant of any differences in the severity at which children and families experience climate change. So the call here is really clear, is not just to tell people about the structural inequities and the disparities that they produce, but rather to explain them, to be really clear that marginalized groups are currently and will be disproportionately affected, and explain how and why. And this is a part of the conversation that I feel like Margot, I'm going to really kind of lean on you to talk about when we get into the panel discussion. The third finding is around attribution of responsibility. This is a familiar finding for anyone who follows framing research on early childhood, is that when pushed, people can think about how climate change impacts caregiving, but then they hold caregivers as kind of exclusively and narrowly responsible for those effects. There is some ability to see a role for government, but that role is immediately compromised by the way that people currently model government as being corrupt and inept in the delivery of services. And we found that solutions are not front of mind. So the recommendations here are to really try as best as we can to shift responsibility from a parents only type of perspective to a government and collective perspective. I'll be really interested from hearing from the panelists about kind of how we can do that. There's a script that we have strong beliefs is going to be effective, which is appealing, kind of walking people through the way that children are affected by the places where they develop, what we call the developmental environment, and then to make it clear that these developmental environments are affected by climate change. And finally, to connect that to solutions. This connection between climate change and caregivers is somewhat of an opportunity. We think that collecting climate change and the way that it impacts adult caregivers is a way of kind of stepping into the conversation about how those effects influence the process of development. And then really, I can't say enough, the importance of priming and being really clear and explicit about solutions. So with that, I love to end every time I talk with a quote. This is one from a philosopher called Richard Rorty, who said that a talent for speaking differently rather than arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change. And I think this is really, like, you couldn't have said it better. The way that we communicate about kids and climate change is not going to be advanced by having more better data that we yell louder from higher rooftops. It is really about thinking about our role as agents of explanation and helping people understand the way that these issues are connected, not just telling them that they are. And so with that, I think I'm gonna stop my share now just so we can see everyone's face. I can see everybody now. That's great. I couldn't see you before. Hey, Lindsey. Hey, Margot. Hey, Jacqueline. How are y'all doing? Margot, I'm gonna start with you if that's okay. And my first question, so first of all, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the work that you lead at the Environmental Defense Fund. Love to hear that. And then if you could talk a little bit about why communicating about this connection between climate change and early childhood is important in the work that you and your colleagues do at the Environmental Defense Fund.
I'm just delighted to be here. It's always great when your career comes full circle. I spent about 11 years at EPA's Office of Children's Health Protection, and now I'm here leading environmental and climate justice at the Environmental Defense Fund. So my career, this is a full circle moment, and I'm delighted to be here today. So just in short, as the Senior Vice President for Justice and Equity at the Environmental Defense Fund, my work is really about making sure that environmental and climate justice are not afterthoughts, but core to everything we do. A lot of times you'll see in the environmental movement that environmental and climate justice are sort of like a sidecar. And we cannot think that way. And that is my role here at EDF, is to get the organization to recognize that it must be core to everything we do. And to a point that you made earlier, we know that the climate crisis doesn't impact everyone equally. And the reality is that people and communities who've contributed the least to the problem, so those are low-income families, communities of color, and especially children, are the ones who suffer the most. So at EDF, what we've got to do is build durable and inclusive climate solutions that improve both environmental and human health outcomes. Because what I fundamentally believe is that true climate progress has to include equity. If we are not protecting the most vulnerable among us, we're not solving the problem. So when we think about communicating the connection between climate change and early childhood development, it is really imperative. And the reason why I use a word like imperative is because I love this quote. I'm sure many of you have heard this quote before, that we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. And right now, the world that we're giving back to them is in real trouble. We've got rising temperatures, worsening air quality, and we had one of the most severe hurricanes in the Caribbean within the last week. And these things are happening now, and they're happening in real time, and they are threatening children's physical and mental health. More than half of the world's children live in countries that are at extremely high risk from climate change. And again, while these countries have contributed the least to climate change, the children in those places will be impacted first and worst. And that's really what climate inequity looks like.
Mm.
As I was preparing for today's presentation, I found a statistic and I had to like double check to make sure it was true. And that a child born in 2020 is going to face 2 to 7 times more extreme weather events in their lifetime than someone born in 1960. And when we think about it, it's like, oh, well, that's a jarring number. But it's more than just a number. This is a moral issue that we're dealing with. This is about intergenerational justice. And if we think about it this way, if we're borrowing something precious like the earth from our children, how could we return it depleted? If our 16-year-old borrowed our car, and when they returned that car, the car was out of gas, it had a flat tire, and a broken transmission, how do we go anywhere? And so this connection that I'm trying to make makes one thing really clear, that protecting children's health is inseparable from protecting the planet. And so we really have to, as we're communicating these things, we have to get people to understand that none of these things are separate. A lot of times when we as communicators, and myself as a former public health practitioner, often talk about our issue in a specific silo. And siloing issues really doesn't serve anyone, because we can't protect everyone if we're all not coming together as leaders in public health or communications or whatever discipline to make sure that every child has the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and have a safe place to live, learn, and play. And what happens when we do this, when we center children in our climate work, and so it's not just climate communications, but all of our climate work, we are able to remind everyone who's working on this issue what's really at stake. And a lot of times I think we lose sight of the fact that it's not just the future of our environment that's at stake, but it's every child's potential. Sit with that for a moment. Every child's potential is at stake every time we miss an opportunity to communicate about the intersection between climate change, climate justice, and children's health.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Margot. You've got quotes, stats, metaphors, and values all in there. Oh my, that was really wonderful. I feel like I could listen to you talk for a very long time. If I could just ask you one follow-up. So clearly in what you said, there's an importance or an imperative to communicate effectively about all of those connections that you just made. I'd love to just hear you um, just kind of talk for a minute about how this research that we've presented, that I just kind of did a quick overview of, might be helpful to you and your colleagues who are working very hard in communicating about those connections. So I guess the question is like, how do you see this research in understanding mindsets and the ways that people do and don't connect these issues, and how we can make these connections in different ways? How is that helpful in the work that you and colleagues are doing at the Environmental
Yeah,
Defense Fund?
that's a great question. One of the things that I think a mistake that we've made in the climate space is that we've made it about mitigation or adaptation, and we use these terms that don't resonate with the common person. You know, I talked about my time at EPA. At EPA, we had to write things at a fifth or sixth grade reading level. And not only is it just writing things at a fifth or sixth grade reading level, one of the other things that we had to do is make sure that we weren't scaring the bejesus out of people, but that we were really giving them a way to act. Like, how do I act on a problem? And we often don't do that when we communicate to folks. I mean, we all know that your zip code is a better predictor of your life expectancy than your genetic code. And this is going to shape your health outcomes. And it's not just here in the United States that we see this, it's around the globe. And we also know that there's a long legacy of systemic racism and disinvestment in historically marginalized communities. And it's limited their access to clean air, clean water, quality housing. And all of these inequities have worn communities down over generations for poorer health outcomes. And now climate change is making these injustices worse because it's really, I like to think of climate change as a threat multiplier. And what that means is it's going to continue to layer on top of all the inequalities that already exist. And what does this mean for a child? It means a lot. It means that a child growing up in a historically marginalized community is going to face greater risk from climate impacts like asthma, extreme heat, food insecurity, and even mental health challenges. And when you take these risks and you combine them with structural inequalities, they create intergenerational cycles for poor health. And that's why when we start thinking about the messaging and how we talk about this, we can't talk about it in a way of my favorite word is my favorite construct is the social determinants of health. I always refer to my parents when I'm talking about communication messages. My father, who recently passed away, had a PhD, but his PhD was on art history. And my mom was a preschool teacher. And if whatever I was trying to explain about the work that I did, like if I could see a blank stare in their face, I knew that I wasn't getting through. And what I've learned is that if you can humanize climate change and talk about the two fundamental things that most humans care about, what are those two fundamental things? It's health and their prosperity. They care about the health of their children. They care about the health of their community. When I talk about prosperity, what I mean is really their ability to provide the basic necessity for themselves and for their children. And so if we can couple this sort of messaging, again, at a fifth or sixth grade reading level, tied to action, where we're talking about every child, like no matter their race, their income, where they live, having a right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and grow up safe, and unlocking their potential, it doesn't just become environmental work. It goes back to this moral work. And it's really and like getting to the emotion of people.
Yep.
Numbers are not going to work. You know, data is not going to work. We've been trying this over and over and over again, and we know that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result. And I really think it's time to meet people where they are and talk about the intersection between health, prosperity, climate, and equality in a way that resonates with their life and not like some esoteric construct that we often tend to do in this space.
Yep. That was great. Thank you so much, Margot. And I feel like that is information and ideas that that Lindsey, you and I have talked about over the years that we've been thinking about these connections. So I want to turn to you next, Lindsey. And I want to start kind of the same way. If you can tell us a little bit about the work that you do at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and then talk about how communicating about the connection between these issues is such a core and important part of that work.
Thanks for bringing together everybody for this conversation today and for everybody that made time to be here, especially with everything going on in the world. And it's just nice to see so many people interested in this issue here, taking time. And Margot, I just really enjoyed learning from you. And like, it's very invigorating to hear you speak with so much energy. It makes me feel good that I'm in this work with you. So the Center on the Developing Child broadly, our team is working really hard as you mentioned, for many years to kind of try to stay really abreast of this ever expanding body around developmental science. And I think there's researchers from increasingly more and more different fields that are contributing to what we really understand about what influences development. And so what we try to do at our center is really synthesize what that science tells us. And then a key part of our work, I think, is really trying to effectively communicate it to a pretty broad range of audiences whose work we feel affects the well-being of kids and the people taking care of them. And I think, like, spoiler alert, everybody's work affects the well-being of children and their caregivers. We can make those connections, even if it doesn't seem like, you're a traditional early childhood person. People in, urban planning and economic policy, these things all affect children's well-being. And so I think the research that you talked about today, Nat, is so important because first, it allows us to have this insight in how the public is thinking now, right? We can make a lot of assumptions about what people think, but this is really meaningful for us as communicators when we go out and we advocate on this issue. And I think developmental science right now is telling this very compelling story about what influences not only brain development, but our hearts, our lungs, our metabolic system, our respiratory system. And as Margot articulated so nicely, I think, like, the environments where kids are growing up, their zip codes, their neighborhoods play a really important role in shaping their development. And increasingly, those neighborhoods and those zip codes are being shaped by the effects of changing climate. So I think it was really helpful to learn from this research that despite what seems very clear in the scientific literature about, like, how widespread and how very true it is that there's negative effects on health and development from climate change, it's not an issue that the public is aware of, and it's actually not a major policy focus. I thought that the statistics from the media were, like, those really put me back on my heels because, we all consume our own media, and my feed, sends me things about children's health and climate change, but it was really actually pretty profound to me how little of a part of the pie it does make up. And I think the opportunity that was identified for me, I think, and love the rotating animated slide there, is the disconnect between the emphasis of how much people notice and sort of appreciate the immediate effects. Like, we hear this, right? Children get heat stroke, they're left in hot cars, there's people that die on hot summer days, but the opportunity is really in making these connections to the long-term developmental effects. And I think, another one of Margot's excellent points, like, when you can start to make those connections for people and really connect how it affects children that they care about across their lifespan, that's a real, I think, opportunity for communicators. So, in terms of what we need to still think about and investigate, you've said it. It's like, how do we go out and connect these issues now? And I think, when I go out in the audiences that I get to engage with and my peers who are out, also advocating for this issue, there's a pretty broad range of ways that we all talk about this. Some of us invoke vulnerability, as you mentioned. Some of us describe, like, intergenerational and compounding effects. And so I'm really excited to learn from this next phase of work, like, how do we actually, which of these things do we choose, and how do we start to streamline and be consistent in our messaging so we can go out and repeat it over and over and over again to not only increase this understanding, but also, mobilize support for the solutions.
That's great. So first of all, thank you for noticing my slides and
It's really
the
good.
way in which I very strategically and effectively use builds to help make my points. Thank you very much, Lindsey.
Yes,
Checks in the mail. So to me, the most surprising thing is also, it's surprising, but it's not, this lack of connection between these issues. And I think that's largely, like, there's a point in which you said, Lindsey, that I just want to highlight. And it's surprising to me because I've hung out with you for too long. Like, I understand these connections inherently. I understand the importance of the developmental environment. I can see the way that climate change is affecting that developmental environment. But to me, one of the things that's so important for us to realize as people who are kind of deep issue experts on the issues that we work on is that we are not our audience, right? Because these concepts that are so inherently, deeply, inextricably connected, as you and Margot have just laid out, they aren't for
No, but
most people
what
most of the time, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, but I actually think, like, maybe even more so than other issues, I totally agree with you. Like, I feel like for this issue though, it actually takes, like, very little to get people to,
Yep.
like, agree and be on board and say, okay, now what? You know, I
Yep.
think that when you make that connection for people, they're almost immediately on board, or I don't know, maybe they're just being nice to me in the Q&A sessions of these presentations. But, you know, I think like with some other issues, there's like a longer build
Yeah.
up to like garnering the like
Yep.
joint understanding and like need for like shared understanding about the solution space. But this is one where like I feel like you know
Yep.
you don't need a lot of time if you do this in the nice way that Margot did and the way that the research lays out. So I don't know, maybe there's hope there.
I agree. And this was kind of one of the recommendations in passing, but it's really kind of highlights what you're saying. Lindsey, there's something really powerful about pointing out the fact that development happens in a place
Yep.
and that climate change is affecting that place. Like it's like a 1-2
Yeah.
that I think is really powerful in getting people from a place where they don't see the connections to a place where they see them as kind of inescapable and clear. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate that, Lindsey. Jacqueline, over to you. I would love to hear, first of all, about your work at Grown Up Navajo first, and then if you could also talk a little bit about how kind of how the impacts of climate change are being experienced by children in indigenous communities in New Mexico where you work or in other parts of the country where you have colleagues and collaborate with others.
Ja, everyone. Jacqueline Russell, Tachini Ani Bashashin, Tokoje Dashache, Dobilagana Dashanella. Look at Chikai Dotsanakana Denasha. I'm just wanting to introduce myself to any relatives that might be watching. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation and founder and CEO of Grown Up Navajo, which really is a education and digital media company dedicated to integrating Dene and Indigenous ways of knowing. Um, and in a way to create greater community building strategies to reimagine a world that amplifies Indigenous sovereignty for the safety and thriving of people and planet. Core of our work really lies like at the ground level of our forests and our mountains and our valleys because as indigenous people like our cultures and our survival is very much ingrained in our earth mother. It is incorporated into when we're talking about just within the United States we have over 574 indigenous nations that are recognized by the federal government. That means that there are 500 unique ways of interacting with that Earth Mother energy, ways of engaging with Turtle Island. And so while my work at Grown Up Navajo doesn't specifically relate to climate, it relates to Mother Earth and the thriving of our people everywhere. And so much of the language I really feel like empowered and emboldened to connect to is really like from Margot's framing of like a threat multiplier. With Indigenous communities, we are up against so much. There is so much visibility, like hurdles that we have to get through just to get to the place where we can talk about the issues and threats that are impacting Indigenous people. Because we are seeing that while we are slowly ticking up like the visibility markers of like just the baseline questions of like, yes, Indigenous people exist today still, right? Even though there are big painted portraits of Andrew Jackson in administrative places in DC, this impact of like the fact that like we are still here and we are fighting for our survival and we are fighting for our understanding of not just our self-determination and sovereignty, but this collective determination, which I feel like is really a framing that
Mhm.
I really try to engage in within our work at Grown Up Navajo, that it's not just about the impacts on Native people, because we've seen the poverty porn, we've seen the vulnerability markers, and we can name that there are so many ways in which Native communities have been disadvantaged, and that is the system working just as it was meant to be, right? The ways that we have to fight for our tribal treaties, the recognition that we have has been in existence prior to the quote founding of this country. And so the work of climate justice is something that is really connected to our spiritual practices, even as we have over half of our communities living in urban areas because of already existence of environmental impacts, like because of climate change, because of economic justice reasons of just having opportunities and economic stability within urban areas versus our homelands. And still we have these places in New Mexico, when we're thinking about children, the impacts on children as it relates to climate change are very much hindered around the impacts of extreme drought, the extreme heat, the recent fallout from the impacts of forest fires that we've had in the recent 5 years, and nuclear fallout of being in a region that has been a test site for the kind of quote clean energy, like of to continue to make our nation thrive, in quotes. And so I think that these are the impacts that we're seeing, and all of the kind of health indicators that that relates to, the rates of anxiety, of depression, of mental health. Like Native youth experience one of the highest rates of suicide in our country. And we see these rates climb in areas like the in Alaska, where we have, just recently within the past few weeks, we've had extreme flooding because of the extreme weather. And so I think that in our communities, there's both a need for our own education of our people and our leadership, because I think our leaders also participate in the upholding of things that accelerate climate change too. And so it's both and with regard to, like, we see what I'm recognizing as both the collective impact that is happening and our collective need for knowledge that aligns very much with the findings like of this study as well.
Well, thank you so much, Jacqueline. There were a lot of heads nodding. Well, there was a lot of head nodding. There's not that many heads that I can see, but Lindsey and Margot were both nodding quite a bit as you were speaking. And I just want to say it's wonderful to have you and your expertise on this call with us here today. And so the follow-up question that I have is, um, if you could talk a little bit more about your ideas for how researchers and advocates who are doing this kind of science translation and advocacy work can do a better job of partnering with Indigenous communities to ensure not only that kind of Indigenous perspectives are acknowledged, but that they're empowered in this work, that there's not just a nod, but that there's kind of power and real space that's given to that deep knowledge and expertise that you have. I'm somewhat selfishly interested in this, so if you can kind of tell us a little bit about how you think about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think that one of the key things that I'll say is that all of this work depends on relationships.
Yep.
That building relationships with Native nations and communities happens at a one-to-one level, right? There's no card that I can give you that's like the connection to the secret room of societies of like Native, like scientists and engineers and so forth. We have definitely those knowledge holders and knowledge keepers and people who are studying with PhDs. We are modern people, right? And we are people that have a very, very acute awareness and integration like of the science, of the findings of the research. And so I think that it's really recognizing both what is your distance like to and from a Native community that you want to work with, and understanding your positionality within that first. I think there's also a recognition that really getting curious and at the grassroots level of like who is doing this work in this community, how to build relationships with them. And then you can zoom out into really building relationships and alliances with regional people who are studying and doing work, whether it's around sacred sites, whether it's around clean water justice, whether it's around like the advocacy for really like nuclear cleanup. Within my own community, we still have so many, over 500 like unmarked, undesignated nuclear uranium mines that have yet to be dealt with within the Navajo Nation. And so I think that you can pick an area within like the climate justice like field, and depending on who you want to make impact with, to work with, there are people there that are able and ready and have been doing the work. So I think just recognizing that it's really about understanding the landscape, and that really will allow for there to be greater impact moving forward. And I also think that if we can think in terms of reciprocity and generative, like what am I thinking of? Generative collaborations, that those are the things that really make a difference. Things where there can be win-win-win, when there's different partners engaged. And so I think that that really is key and important when beginning to think about researching with and alongside Indigenous community partners and knowledge holders.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. And I just, a couple of things that you said that, for what it's worth, really resonate to me is this idea of existing Indigenous leadership, kind of an Indigenous-led solutions, feels really important to take from everything that you said was important, Jacqueline, but those are a couple of things that like really, like especially resonated to me. So thank you very much. Um, Let's shift to some of the questions that came in from participants as pre-submits. I'm going to lay out a question. It doesn't need to be all three of you that answer them, but if someone kind of feels a particular spirit to jump in, why don't you go first, and then I'll just kind of try to manage our time so that we can make our way through a couple of them. So, Margot, you said, I'm not calling on you, but you commented on this, and it was kind of a theme in a lot of the questions that we received, about kind of how heavy these issues are, how overwhelming they are. And I guess the question is kind of like, and we know very well that when issues are heavy, when they're overwhelming, there's a tendency to disengage, to turn away, to think that the things are unsolvable, and to take our attention and put them on issues that we feel like have a better chance of doing something about. And so my question to all of you is like, what can we do about that? Like, what is your thinking about how to, um, yeah, like how to present these issues in a way that leads people to lean in and not be so fatalistic that they exit as fast as they can? That's a hard question. I don't know if there's an answer to that question. I imagine people have ideas, and I think that's all that we can offer the folks who are online. So, whoever, Margot, you went off of mute. Do you want to jump in
Yeah.
on that one?
So one of the things that I think is a missed opportunity is we've been having this whole conversation about children, and I'll throw in youth. Why are they not part of the dialogue? Why are we not bringing children in and youth in to the dialogue to help with the conversation that we're having? I think it would be far more powerful to get their perspective. I mean, Jacqueline talked about like climate anxiety and mental health with youth. And we also know that while it's highest among, kids who are probably like 13 to 14 years old, research has taught us that these kids are also the ones who still believe that they can change the world. This age group believes that they can still make a difference. Why are we not working with them on this? They're also the ones who are running social media. They're the ones who are running TikTok, and I think we need to get far more creative and recognize different lived expertise and not think
Yep.
that we have all the answers.
Yep. That really, start to finish, that answer really resonates with me. And I think connects to a number of the things that Jacqueline said. So I just spent earlier this week in Colorado with a group of youth advocates, many of whom are Indigenous leaders, young leaders. And this issue is front and center for those folks. And so I think, kind of going back to what you said, Jacqueline, a lot of this is about really understanding the landscape and making connections rather than trying to, and you weren't saying this, Margot, rather than trying to kind of give birth to something new. It's to realize where these conversations are happening. And I do think that they're happening, and getting better about connecting, and making connections between groups that are interested in, engaged with, have passion, have expertise, and are doing this work. So thank you very much, Margot. There's a lot of questions, which is like the flip side of the overwhelm. There's a lot of questions from participants about solutions. And so I can't end without talking about solutions. This may be our last question, depending on how long we talk, but I think it's a really important one in terms of framing that we end on solutions. And so I would be really curious to hear kind of what people have to say about how we can use what we know about these connections to design better physical spaces, or what can we do on the solution side of this conversation?
I'm happy to talk briefly, but I'd actually love to hear what the other panelists think about this. So I'll try not to take a lot of time. I mean, I think when I think about this question, which I think comes up sometimes in our spaces, that all the things that are good for design elements in physical spaces for climate mitigation are also really good for healthy development. So like we know if we want to take heat, heat has really important effects on developmental environments and thereby development. So start with cooling indoor and outdoor spaces where kids spend time, and then if you cool outdoor spaces, with shade being the most effective way to do it outside, then kids can play outside and exercise and be together and, explore and be curious and have better behavior when they go back inside, which benefits the adults. So I think these things are synergistic. So when we start to solve around one, we end up solving for the other.
So that's like a solutions multiplier rather
Solutions
than
multiplier.
rather than the other side of the coin, which I think is clearly a viral metaphor, Margot, that you introduced of threat multiplier. I think we've each used that one, but the fact that there may be, Lindsey, like a solutions multiplier as well.
Yeah, I think
Jacqueline,
so.
I want to give you if you'd like to, the last word on this and kind of how you think in your work about solutions.
I think that solutions don't always have to be new, right? That I think there's like a context that like it has to be recreated. We have to like think of the new thing that is going to like save us. And I think there's a real value in returning to practices. My husband and I are scheming like how we will build basically our version of an Adobe Hogan, the Hogan being my traditional home and Adobe being the earth made homes from his Pueblo communities. And so that fusion like of our relationship and our love for each other, but also in that the inherent indigeneity practices of like of our dwellings like as people. I think that there's such a value in recognizing we can solve for many things if we do this together. The connections and the value of our relationships and our connectivity of coming back to each other also solves like the loneliness epidemic, also solves these other things like where that we've just like begun because of modernity, begun to separate out and create apathy and hopelessness. That if we are able to come together, that there's value in that in and of itself is its own healing balm, right? And so I think that that's something that I would uplift.
And I think I could not think of a better way to end this conversation with that kind of that solidarity and that uplifting of solutions and hope. So thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you, Lindsey and Margot as well. This has been, I feel like I have learned a ton from the three of you, which is my preferred way to spend my day and time. So I'm gonna just bring us to a close really quick here. So first of all, encourage everybody on the call to check out the research, to try to use it in the way that you're thinking, to frame on in the work that you do. If everybody wouldn't mind following through to the QR code and filling out a quick survey. I think my colleagues are also going to drop some other links, sign up for our newsletter, check us out on social media, and just a major, major thank you to the three panelists, Lindsey, Margot, and Jacqueline. It was wonderful to get the chance to talk with you. I thank you very much for your time and your wisdom and your expertise and all your great framing ideas and content knowledge. And to everybody who's made the decision to spend the last hour, not the last hour, an hour of your lives with us here on this webinar. I really appreciate it. So thank you very much, everybody. Take care. And like I said, frame on.